Hello everyone, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here today. I am not an engineer, but I have profound respect for everything that the engineers do, and I am a huge advocate for ensuring that the work done by engineers around the world, and specifically in Canada as well, is appreciated and respected, and that we ensure that it is consistent with consumer trust, because I think it's critical for all of us and all of the work that we've heard about today. So I'm not going to talk about technology per se today. As I said, I'm not a technologist, but I do want to talk about the environment in which we are all innovating and what is happening today. So what we're seeing is a very real tension out there in the world, where we are aware of cultural shifts that have taken place, and regulatory shifts, and our current events have led consumers to be quite fearful about what is happening. We've had a proliferation of high-profile data breaches around the world. We have public scrutiny that is increasing, and skepticism about authority, about how we are handling data. For the first time in many years, certainly in North America, we are hearing discussions about Big Brother, and they are no longer about, just George Orwell's novel. This is a real fear that people have now about the growing surveillance community that we are living in, and the technology that is being used to surveil individuals, whether it's by government, but even more insidiously, often by commercial organizations. And those two worlds are beginning to merge. And there's a lot of talk about that in the media, and that is a very real concern for anyone who is trying to innovate and develop with data. On the opposite side of that, so we have this fear. At the same time, we have organizations that are aware of the vast amounts of data that we are collecting, more than ever before. We all know that. That goes without saying today. So we have this proliferation of data, and we are acutely aware of how valuable that data is. I don't need to go through all the tropes about, it's like oil, it's the new oil, it's the new gold, it's the new environment. We need to value it. We know that. So right now what we're seeing is organizations and governments that are focused on how to derive new insights and leverage the value in the data. Looking at new revenue streams. And at the same time that this is happening, we are seeing significantly increasing growing risk profiles based on new technology. So AI, these very, very, what we call super profiles of individuals that can be created just in the commercial setting, where we have organizations that are sharing data, and the technology itself is just now creating this increasingly sensitive profiles on individuals. But I don't want to gloss over the value that is in this data. I don't want this to be a scary talk. That it is tremendously valuable, and we know that we can leverage data to solve many of the world's problems. If we could be more data-driven about just about every decision that we make, we would be making better decisions. We could improve healthcare tremendously. This is a huge area of focus for TELUS specifically. We have a whole TELUS Health division, and really there's a strong belief that if we can leverage technology and leverage data, we can be more efficient in the way that we deliver healthcare. We can find cures to diseases. We can figure out exactly what is working, what is not working. The opportunities are endless when it comes to the healthcare world, but it's also endless when we look at opportunities in the commercial settings at the other end of the spectrum. Ways that our organizations and our companies can become more competitive, can employ more people. Sometimes people talk about the social benefits of doing things with data versus the commercial benefits. I don't really like that dichotomy. I think that doing things with data that help our companies be more competitive in the world allows us to help people as well. It creates jobs, it creates a tax base that we can do more of these good things. So to say, well, this is only commercially beneficial versus socially beneficial is a false dichotomy. So we have a huge amount of promise that is in data today. But we also have a corresponding huge erosion of trust. And I don't want to just call out Facebook, but we all know that that was a very significant event, that the world suddenly woke up to data use being a concern and not just the securing of our data. Up until that point, when we talked about privacy breaches, we were always talking about unauthorized access to data and identity theft. Not something that, unless you've experienced, most people can relate to the impact of data identity theft. But when we're suddenly talking about abuse and misuse of our data in ways that could potentially manipulate us, that could potentially undermine democracy, that could change the face of the globe when we are unaware of that we can be so clearly manipulated. That is a very significant erosion of trust. So we now have a population that is focused on data use in a way that it never was before. So we have a very significant possibility that all of this promise in data could be for naught, that we will not be able to leverage it, and one of two things could happen. We will either be regulated out of existence, because we know that if the lawmakers get in there and make knee-jerk reactions, have knee-jerk reactions to legislation, that we will have laws that don't work. They're unlikely to understand the complexities of the technology and the opportunities that we have to do great things with technology and data that don't necessarily undermine respect for individual privacy. Alternatively, we will have simply lost trust. And so maybe the ecosystem that continues today will continue. We will not be regulated out of existence, but nobody will want to participate in that digital ecosystem if they can't trust it. Either way, the promise is lost. We heard Dr. Harrison yesterday talking a lot about trust, and I was excited to hear that, and happy to hear that we've got various areas of the world and various areas of academia that are focused on trust. He talked about encouraging others to trust us. I want to talk about how we can be trustworthy, how we actually become worthy of that trust. It's critically important that we go out there and we learn how to make people trust us, but we better be darn sure that we're worthy of that trust before we do that, or it will be lost for good. We are, in fact, at a tipping point. I love this quotation by Giovanni Buttarelli. I also just like saying his name. He is, unfortunately, the late EU data protection supervisor. He just recently passed away, but was a very big advocate for privacy, but also for technology. And he recognized that technology should not dictate our values and rights. We do not want it to be used to manipulate us. But at the same time, promoting innovation with data and preserving fundamental rights should not be perceived as incompatible. We can do both. We absolutely can do both. So how can we build trust when the data use that we're talking about is actually beyond the understanding of most individuals? Sometimes it's beyond the understanding of all individuals if we're talking about artificial intelligence, where we don't necessarily know what is going to be happening with the data as machines learn. So the old models of, well, I got you to sign off on my privacy policy, be it 3 lines or 30 pages, so therefore you've consented to whatever I'm going to do, they are not good enough anymore. First of all, we already know nobody reads those policies. Second, even if we could put in those policies, even if people did read them, we can't put in those policies everything about what we're doing with data, because we don't necessarily even understand everything that we will do with data after we collect it. It is no longer good enough. So one of the answers, and this is not the only answer, is to focus on accountability. And by that, I in part mean, how can we be actually trustworthy? And for us to be accountable, to use data responsibly, and to say that we're using it responsibly, there are a few points, and they're going to sound really trite, but they are very difficult. We need to ourselves clearly understand, our developers, our businesses, our governments, how we are using the data and the related technology that is using it. And that seems self-evident, but it is very challenging. There are so many organizations that are using technology, selling technology, developing technology that they themselves don't fully understand the implications of. We can't afford to keep making mistakes about what's happening with our data. We have to understand exactly what is happening with the data before we launch. We need to clearly understand how our data processes will be measured against social norms. And in fact, that they will be measured against social norms. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about social norms in a moment, because that's a tricky one. And this is an international event, And we all know that social norms are not the same internationally. They're not even the same generationally within the same community. So we have to be really thoughtful about how we approach anything to do with social norms. But we at least know some things are true. So I'll get back to that in a second. We also have to consider how our data processes, so how the collection of data, the use of data, the protection of data, the disclosure of data, how those processes will be governed. We have to think about that in advance. And then we have to think about how they will be explained to others. And I think this is a really important one. If we are thinking about how what we are doing with data will be explained to others, it will impact what we decide to do with data. Can we explain what we plan on doing with data in a way that is simple, in a way that is straightforward, in a way that is true, and in a way that won't make me, for example, feel red in the face if I'm explaining it to our media, that I can be proud of. We're doing something with data that I can be proud of, or at least certainly not embarrassed about. If we can't come up with that narrative and make it true, we shouldn't be doing that with data. Because how can we have people trust us if we can't explain what we're doing and can't feel good about it? So right from the get-go, the moment we have an idea, we should be thinking about the narrative, the story around that idea. Big picture, is this feeling okay? Is this consistent with something that we can publicly talk about and not be embarrassed about? The approach to focusing on accountability and being trustworthy also requires what I call now X by design. So privacy by design, security by design, ethics by design. And what I just talked about, that narrative concept, is part of, I think, ethics by design. It's part of privacy by design, it's part of security by design. Because if you can't tell that narrative, then you've missed something in your design of your system. But we have to think about how we are designing solutions right from the get-go. We have to think about privacy and security as core requirements in what we are doing. So I talked about the social norms, and this has required a shift in discussions around data handling from straight security and technology to a discussion about ethics. And this is actually hugely uncomfortable for so many people. So especially for technologists, they just want to develop the technology. Don't want to be thinking about the uses, the rights, the wrongs, how it's going to be used. Just want to develop the technology because it's super cool to develop this technology. I think I can make it do X, I'm going to make it do X, and this is going to be really cool. That's what I hear all the time. So we have to start thinking about this because what's really cool might not be okay. But when we're talking about ethics, then it gets a little muddy. Whose ethical framework are we using? What ethical framework? For those who might actually have taken a course in ethics in university, we've got Kantian ethics, we've got utilitarian ethics, we've got all these different types of ethics. What model are we using, and how can we even begin to talk about this? So this gets so uncomfortable that people just avoid the subject altogether. So what we need is a common approach. And I'm not saying we're there, but I'm saying we're getting there, and we need to work on getting there. Other practical issues. So what I'm talking about is a lot of governance. How we are going to design things, how we are going to assess those designs, how we're going to develop that narrative, how we're going to talk about it, how we're going to be sure that we're being transparent about it. That's a lot of governance. And at the very same moment in time, we are trying to get to market really quickly because the world is innovating really quickly and markets are moving really quickly. So how do we balance a more rigorous governance process with speed to market? Another practical issue, avoiding bias. Anything that is involving large amounts of data, and particularly anything involving artificial intelligence, but any data analytics, we run the risk of having data bias, algorithmic bias, bias in the application of our insights. We need to be super careful that what we are doing is not perpetuating or making worse problems that have existed in our societies for a long time, or that we're simply not having inaccurate outcomes, making poor business decisions, poor healthcare decisions because we don't have the right data. So again, rigorous analysis, rigorous governance around assessing how we are using data. Data quality also ties into the accuracy of our insights. One thing that, I talked earlier about X by design and this concept of privacy by design, security by design. Really, really important, because in the past what we have talked about when it came to privacy is this concept of privacy impact assessments. And those have been done on an international basis in different industries and pockets over the past decade or so. And what that always involved was, before you launch, we need to look at your entire process or your service or your product, and we need to determine whether or not, what are the impacts to privacy and how can we mitigate those. Seems very simple, but when we get into things like machine learning or ongoing IoT devices that actually then decisions get made over time based on data that's collected, we're no longer talking about a point in time of a product or service where we can assess it. So it isn't the same product or service 6 months after it launched that it was when you first launched it. Because the machine may have learned to do something different. The machine may have received data and be doing things that we never anticipated. So how can we then assess what the privacy impacts might be or the ethical impacts might be if we have a machine that is continually changing what it is doing? This requires us to look at a completely different governance process, which includes ongoing monitoring. Are these systems working the way we expected them to work? How can we test them? That is not an easy thing to do. But engineers such as, yourselves and many others around the world, they are the answer to that. So how can we engineer systems that actually can self-monitor or that can put those guardrails in right from the get-go? That would be the new form of privacy, security, or ethics by design, that we can actually figure out, okay, well, what are the guardrails that we can, how much can we anticipate here, and what are the guardrails? And of course, all of this will depend on what we're talking about. So if we're talking about data systems which might determine who gets a piece of marketing, maybe that's not the end of the world if we make a mistake. If some group gets the marketing that shouldn't have got it, or some group doesn't get the marketing who should have got it, not the end of the world. Maybe we don't need to monitor as frequently for that. But when we are talking about systems that could actually impact people in really meaningful ways and potentially harm individuals, whether or not someone gets a mortgage, whether or not someone gets a heart transplant, whether or not someone gets into or out of a country, these are systems that we need to be monitoring really carefully, really frequently. We need to be certain of what they are doing, and we need to have engineered them in a way that allows us to be certain. The other piece that is complex today is the complexity of the technology itself competing with our desire to be transparent. So I talked earlier about this concept of a narrative, that I want to be able to explain what we are doing, but we are getting increasingly complex. It's a lot harder to explain. I actually like it if I can figure it out, because I'm not an engineer. So if I can explain it, if someone can explain it to me in a meaningful way, and I can explain it in a meaningful way, then I think we're pretty close to there. But as we're getting more complex, that becomes harder to do, and we have to be much more thoughtful about how we can be transparent with individuals about what we are doing with their data. So what are we doing at TELUS? Because I've just thrown out a whole lot of problems and a whole lot of challenges that are not easy, and we have not solved them. So I am asking the people in this room and the tremendous brain power that is in this room to help us solve these problems, because we have to. So what we are doing is we've been developing data governance models, and we've been testing them for the last couple of years in various ways. What works, what's fast, what's efficient, what misses things, what catches things, what's catching too much so it's not fast and efficient anymore. We've been working with the Information Accountability Foundation, the IAF, which is a think tank based out of the US, but is globally focused and is actually really plugged in well with a lot of the, with all of the international privacy regulators. So looking at their thinking around data governance, as well as other leading thinkers and think tanks internationally. So what are the models that they have been coming up with? And actually what we've been doing is testing a lot of those models. And I've been working closely, as Wahad said, I am on the board of the IAF, so I often have access to some of these models a little bit before they're fully public, and it allows us to test them in a real business environment to see if they work, because often they don't. So we've been taking those and we've been building the best design, the best practices into our design process. So right from design, right through to the go-to-market piece. Focusing on de-identification models and on re-identification risk management, and that includes synthetic data and some of the opportunities there. It includes sometimes looking at blockchain, as well as a more traditional de-identification of personal information. One of the things that's been really great for us has been to look at focus groups. Not the cheapest thing to do, but really important for us to understand what is and is not okay with individuals today. And this gets us back to that concept of social norms, because they are shifting, and it has to be contextual. So as we're looking at potentially doing something with data, those of us who are mired in this and thinking about it all the time might lose touch with what the average individual is thinking is important to them and what they will care about. So it's easy for us to say, no, everyone wants these very targeted, customized sales, or nobody wants this. Let's think about it. Let's ask the individuals how they feel about it. How do they want their data used? Do they want their data used to help find a cure for cancer or not? Do they want their data used to help us figure out who to market to or not? How would they feel if we de-identified it? How would they not feel if we de-identified it? Very revealing answers sometimes in those focus groups. And it also allows us, when it comes to that narrative that I talked about, to be able to say back, well, we asked our customers and this is what they said. So it helps us in our narrative, our defense, if you will, but it also helps us get it right in the first place. So it helps engender trust, and it helps us be more trustworthy. We've also been doing a lot of work on transparency. What does it mean to be transparent with customers? It doesn't mean that everybody wants to hear every single thing about, nobody wants to read the 30-page privacy policy. Not everybody wants to know exactly what we're doing on de-identification. Some people couldn't care less. Some people care very, very deeply. So how can we have a layered approach to the information that we provide to customers? Often they will go to our privacy website. All they really want to know is, are we keeping their text message content? That's the most common question we get. But some of them will want to know a whole lot more than that. So how can we make that information accessible to them quickly, but also layer it in? Looking at also at concept of just in time. What's the most important thing for individuals to know? Doing some lobbying work. A lot of governance, a lot of best practices in privacy laws over the last decade have been, you need to tell everybody everything you're doing with their data and every piece of data you're collecting. You know what? If you open a bank account, you know they collect your name and your address, and you know why. So you can set up a bank account. It is a waste of time, our time, your time, everyone's time, to put in the privacy policy that we collect your name and address so that you can set up an account. Why don't we just have policies that tell people what we're doing that might actually be really interesting and important to them? How can we come up with a way to just give them the impactful information, not the silly stuff where the impactful information gets buried? So I talked earlier about privacy impact assessments, that point-in-time concept. But we've moved from that now to what we are now calling data impact assessments, beyond just what we're doing with personal information, into broader aspects of how we're assessing data. So we're trying to achieve this concept of X by design, privacy, security, ethics. Is this right? Is this consistent with our own corporate principles? Because every organization is going to have some of those that are a little bit different. So ways that we've approached this: challenge and empower our development and design teams. Let's not keep all the privacy and security information, the checklists, the criteria, sitting inside the privacy office and the security office. We need to be able to give that to the people who are designing the tools, the products, the services, the technology, so that they can build in accordance with those criteria. I can't imagine that anything could be more frustrating than going and building something and then coming to your privacy office and having them say, no, that's not okay, it doesn't meet these criteria that I didn't tell you about, but I have my little secret checklist over here that I'm gonna decide whether or not yours is a pass or a fail. Ask them what matters. Ask them how to build it. Make sure you're getting the information so that you can build according to the criteria that matter in today's world. I think, again, the most important thing, and what I talk to our teams about, is explainability in the narrative. Make sure you understand exactly what this is going to be used for and what's going to be happening with the data. This can't be, as I said, a point in time that's later after development. It has to be earlier assessments. I've got this idea. What do you think? The idea, well, you know what? That's a great idea. You couldn't maybe do it that way, but you could do it this way. So I talk to my team and I say, we do not want to say no. We want to say yes, but this is maybe the way, this is how. Yes, but differently. There are almost always ways to gain the value that we want from the data, but in a privacy respectful way, in an ethical way. Almost always. When we look at these more impactful, these greater data impact assessments, one of the things that we've started to do is to look at, and this has been consistent across the board with all the different think tanks internationally, we have to start having a broader sense of who the stakeholders are in any technology. So who might be interested in this technology? Who could it present a risk to? Who could it present a benefit to? Might the government be interested in it? Might certain consumer groups be impacted differently? Breaking it down more and more so that we understand how this could affect different individuals differently. Considering your different market components, for example, would be one set. Then we assess, when we've figured out what are the risks and benefits to all the stakeholders, then we assess those against a set of common values. And I talked earlier about how hard it is to come up with a set of common values. We've been leveraging the Information Accountability Foundation work, and they're actually led by a sociologist, which I love. He's an academic, and he, rather than being a lawyer or an engineer, is purely looking at these questions from a sociological perspective. And he's come up with 5 values that are pretty consistent internationally, and all of the privacy regulators internationally have bought into his model of those 5 values. And you can, I'm not going to put up slides with the 5 values, but beneficial, progressive, fair, I can't even remember the other 2 right now, but lots of information about them on the website if you are interested. So we've been modeling that. It's been working very well. I think there's a tremendous amount of promise in that. And we're currently adjusting it to layer in concepts that are unique to AI, so algorithmic bias. And one of the things that's, that I talked about earlier, which is, more unique to AI concepts, which is this absence of time between when you do some analysis and you make a decision. So in the past, it used to be we would do some research and we'd find out, oh, well, people who do this are more likely to do that. So maybe we should market this differently, or we should treat these people differently, or we should, have different benefits for them. But now we've got AI systems that are actually processing data and taking action instantaneously. There's no moment in between where we can decide if this is the right thing to do. And we used to talk about thinking with data. You've got more freedom to think with data, but when you act with data, you are going to be held to a higher standard. But now we're thinking and acting, thinking, acting all at once. So we have to have a totally different way of approaching our engineering and those guardrails that I talked about, because we need to be aware of the fact that the machines are going to think and act all at once. So this is actually really hard stuff. I don't have all the answers, as is glaringly apparent, I'm sure. But it is critically important that we're focused on these questions. And I know that if we get enough organizations focused on this, we get enough engineers focused on this, that we can get the answers we need and we can change the game. Because if we don't, we will lose all of that promise. We have tremendous promise, and the benefit is absolutely real if we can get there and leverage this data. So please join me in this mission of mine to engender trust in our ecosystem by being trustworthy. And happy to talk with any one of you and any one of the organizations that you might work with or for to talk about how we can build these systems that will allow us to do what we want to do with data, but in a way that is respectful of individuals.